Yes, hello and good afternoon to everyone joining us here virtually for our press conference. We are very happy to be able to share the latest edition of the Global Climate Risk Index today. And before we start, my name is David Eckstein. I'm a senior policy advisor for climate finance at Germanwatch. And with me on the panel is my colleague Vera Künzel, who is a senior policy advisor for adaptation and human rights. Then we have my colleague Lina Adil, who is a policy advisor for adaptation and loss and damage. And last but not least, we have our colleague Laura Schäfer, who is the head of our international climate policy division here at Germanwatch. And our agenda for today looks as follows. I will briefly start with the methodology and explain a bit how the index works. Then my colleague Vera will introduce this year's results. And followed by that, Lina will explain a bit what the results mean and provide an interpretation. And following that, we will have an input from Laura, who will then discuss the policy implications that the results have for the international climate policy process. After that, we will have a question and answer session where you can raise questions. You will be able to raise your questions in person. We will then provide you the floor. And you can also ask questions in the Q&A function in the Zoom software down below. And my colleague Linus will then moderate that session and give you the floor to speak or read out questions that you have posed. The session will also be recorded and we are streaming live on YouTube, so other stakeholders can follow as well. And after the session, you will also be able to have a look at the presentation on our website, along with the materials for the index. So I will now briefly go over the methodology and explain how the index works. So we have two time components in the index, one that looks at the last individual year for which we have a full set of data, which in this case is the year 2022. And we also have a 30-year average that starts in 1993. What the index does is it analyzes the quantifiable impacts of extreme weather events and visualizes how countries are affected by them. In the current set, we have 171 countries in the database. When we talk about extreme weather events, we look at three hazard groups that you can see here on the slide: hydrological, meteorological, and climatological events. I will go into more detail in the next slide of what they mean. To calculate the index, we have 6 indicators that can be divided into 2 indicator groups: economic and human impacts. I will also address them later in my next slide. And as the last point on the parameters, we use data from the International Disasters Database, MDAT. And for the socioeconomic data, we use the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank database. So on this slide, you can see the hazard groups that we have following the classification according to the MDAT database. In the hydrological group, we have floods, mass movements, and mass movements. In the meteorological group, we have storms and extreme temperatures. And the climatological hazard group has wildfires, drought, and glacial lake outburst floods in them. As you can see here on the slides, 3 of the 6 indicators are in absolute terms, while 3 are in relative terms, where we put the indicator in perspective to the size of the country's population and the size of the country's GDP. And as stated in my previous slide, we have economic impacts and human impacts, which we factor with 50% each. On the left side of the donut, in the blue and light bluish color, you see the economic losses. And on the right side of the donut in orange and light orange, you see the fatalities, and in purple and light purple, the people that have been affected. With every methodology, there are obviously also some limitations that I will briefly like to address in my last slide. So first of all, we have limitations in terms of the raw data, especially when we talk about direct versus indirect impacts. The data that we have only address direct impacts, and we know that for many, many extreme weather events, the indirect impacts can be a lot bigger than the direct impacts. And secondly, we also face data gaps that we have to deal with, and my colleague Lina will address this issue and provide a sensitivity analysis that we have conducted to try to bridge this gap. Then, when we talk about climate risks, we are not discussing all climate risks, but only slow onset climate risks. Only rapid onset climate risks, slow onset climate risks are not covered in the database. For example, sea level rise or glacier melting. And we have to say as well, we look at past data, so we can't make a linear projection of what future impacts mean. So with these limitations, it's clear that we don't provide an all-encompassing analysis of countries' actual or future risks from climate change. But we provide one important part of the puzzle to explain the extent of climate-related impacts and what they mean for countries. And it is clear that, especially when we look at the ever-growing literature on climate change as an important factor for these events, it also analyzes what role climate change plays. With this, I hand over to Vera, who will then present the results.
Thank you very much, David, and also a warm welcome from my side. I will now give you an overview of the key results of our index this year. First, looking into the time frame of 1993 until 2022, the 30 years, we see the 10 most affected countries here on the slide, led by Dominica, followed by China and Honduras. Then we have Myanmar, Italy, India, Greece, Spain and Vanuatu, and on the 10th rank, the Philippines. And the reasons for this ranking are, for example, numerous devastating storm events like the Hurricane Maria in Dominica in 2017, which led to losses of 270% of the country's GDP, which is a really devastating loss for the small island state of Dominica. Then we had Hurricane Mitch in Honduras in 1998, which significantly set back the development process of the country, which is one of the poorest countries. We had the Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, Typhoon Haiyan in Philippines that many people may remember, and a Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. And all of those events were really important for this ranking, but also floods in many countries, like in China, around the Yangtze River in 1993 or 2016. And we also had a lot of heat waves, intense heat waves, for example, in India with temperatures around 50 degrees, but also in a European or different European heat waves affecting countries like Italy, Greece, or Spain. If we now, on the next slide, look into the indicators that were, or the reasons that were important, we see that most people died due to storm events, 36%, followed by heat waves with 30% of the fatalities, and floods, 27%. We see that floods led to the most people affected. Half of the people affected in that 30-year time frame were affected due to flood events. And then we see that storms caused by far the greatest economic losses worldwide in that 30-year time frame, 56%. And those key results mean for us, or we see that 765,000 people have died in the 30 years between 1993 and 2022 as a direct result of more than 9,400 extreme weather events worldwide. And those events led to direct economic losses that amounted to almost 4.2 trillion US dollars, which is adjusted to inflation. And it shows us that over the long term, or the ranking shows us that over the long term, global South countries are particularly affected. We see that 5 countries of the 10 most affected in the 30-year time frame were from the lower middle income group, and is then the largest group in terms of the different income categories. And we see that those countries have significantly lower coping capacities, which is of course important when looking into how long also countries are affected from these events. We have 2 countries, or had 2 countries from the upper middle income group and 3 also from the high income group. And in general, we can say that there are 2 categories of countries or 2 ways that countries are affected. One group is affected by unusual, devastating events, and the other one is facing continuous threats. So the countries that are most affected by highly unusual and very extreme or devastating events are countries like Dominica, Honduras, or Myanmar, or Vanuatu. And those events can set back the development process in a country for many years and have really extreme effects. And we also have those countries that are affected by recurring events and sometimes do not really have the time to recover from an event until the next one hits again. And we see, when we also look into what climate science shows us, is that climate change increases the risk for both of the categories and can contribute to transform the unusual, uncommonly extreme events into continuous threats, creating something like a new normal. And now on the next slide, you see the world map, giving you an overview of the countries affected in the 30-year time frame. And then on the next slide, I would give you an overview of the countries most affected in 2022. So for the 1 year, we see Pakistan on the first rank, then Belize and Italy, Greece, Spain, Puerto Rico, the United States, Nigeria, Portugal, and Bulgaria. That are the 10 most affected countries in 2022. And this is due to, for example, flood events after torrential rainfalls, like in Pakistan, where 10% of the country has been inundated, but also in Nigeria, that experienced a flood that was among the country's worst ever floods. We also had storm events like the Hurricane Lisa in Belize, but also Fiona in Puerto Rico and Hurricane Ian in the US, and also an exceptional extreme heat wave in Europe, which is the fastest warming continent, and that heat wave caused droughts and wildfires all over the continent. It was the worst European drought in 500 years, and it affected, of course, all of the European countries that you see here on the list. Italy on the third rank, but also Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Bulgaria were heavily affected. And if we're now looking into the indicators, we can tell that heat waves were by far the deadliest extreme event in 2022. 83% of the fatalities were or appeared due to heat waves. Drought led to the most affected countries. To the most affected people, 59%. And storms were responsible for the highest economic losses in 2022. For example, Hurricane Ian caused a lot of economic losses in the US and was the costliest event in 2022. And if we're now looking into what those results show us, it shows that countries in all world regions can be affected and were affected in that year, regardless of their income levels. 7 of the 10 most affected countries belong to the high income country group. And the index shows us, or the results shows that there's a huge gap in comprehensive risk management, also in high income countries, and really a gap that needs to be filled. And across all countries, we also see that the most vulnerable groups are most affected. And I would end with the key results with that world map of 2022, where you see the most affected or the countries affected worldwide. And I would now hand over to my colleague Lina for the next part. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vera. For the next few minutes, I'll be explaining some of the key considerations that must be taken into account in understanding the results and also to put them in a broader context. The first key consideration is the link between extreme weather events and climate change. We know that attribution science has come a long way in establishing this link, and it has been clearly demonstrated. The IPCC 6 assessment report mentions that human-caused climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. This has led to widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people. It's important to note here that while some events like heat waves have a more direct causal link, there are other events such as wildfires where the influence could be less direct. As climate change intensifies, the preconditions such as low humidity or rainfall deficits, which influence the frequency and intensity of wildfires. Second key consideration is the data question. And to start with, producing an index includes analyzing and looking at a vast amount of data. And the quality and availability of the data plays a central role to the quality of the index that we produce. Within the context of the climate risk index, we rely on scientific best practices and methodologies, which are constantly evolving. And we aim to ensure the highest level of accuracy, completeness, and granularity. However, there are still some key data challenges, especially for the Global South countries. Some of the reasons that we identified are listed below. And the first one is the weather stations are not evenly distributed around the world, and they are key to register extreme weather events. One example is that for the EU and the US, there is 636 weather stations, where for all of Africa, there is 37 weather stations. Second reason is that many global South countries rely on NGOs for data. And while this is not a challenge on its own, NGOs often lack sufficient connection to meteorological services, which is usually administered by government authorities. A third challenge is that there is variation in technique in registering the impacts from extreme weather events. So, for example, some use excess mortality rates versus official records of mortalities. Finally, climate change impact research is predominantly conducted in the global north, which could potentially underrepresent vulnerable regions, particularly for some countries in the global south. This is also evident in the large attribution knowledge gaps, where there is a lack of good weather data and well evaluated climate models. Next slide, please. To better understand the consequences of these data gaps, we conducted a sensitivity analysis to the original ranking of the climate risk index. And here we use the Human Development Index as a correcting factor, as an approximation of data gaps. And the reason behind this is that there are several studies that concluded that data gaps correlate with GDP and government spending. And hence here, HDI is used as a proxy for data availability. Before I go into it, this sensitivity analysis should not be interpreted as a definitive correction for the disparities in data availability, but rather as an attempt to account for potential underreporting in the global south. If you look at the graph, this is a snapshot into the long-term ranking from 1993 to 2022. We see that there are now 9 developing countries amongst the 10 most affected. Honduras, Vanuatu, the Philippines, and Haiti move up in the ranking because of the HDI correction, while Italy is still there because of the very high fatalities resulting from the 2022 heat waves. We also see that many developed countries move out of this group, including Greece and Spain. And again, this does not should just be understood as a sensitivity analysis to the original results presented before. Next slide, please. Okay, so from these challenges, we think that there are different calls for actions. We see that gaps in data and research shape how we understand climate risks, and how we understand them shape how they are addressed. Sometimes we could end up at an incomplete picture of vulnerabilities. Strengthening data collections is very important, but also broadening the sources of and perspectives that inform scientific assessments. Also very clear from looking at the results that there is disproportionate vulnerability. When we look at the household level, poorer households are more exposed, they recover more slowly and often face incomplete recovery. Examples from the Philippines show that post-typhoon economic losses continue for years, with 90% of the total losses often occurring in the recovery phase. More on the system level, there are systematic barriers to resilience building. Inequality, poverty, marginalization, and low income increase vulnerability, particularly for indigenous people and local communities, which limits their adaptive capacities and increases exposure to extreme weather events. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Laura.
Thank you very much, Lina. This last part of our presentation will look into what the results of the Climate Risk Index mean for international climate policy, the climate and security nexus, and the German federal elections that will soon happen. And so the results as presented by Vera clearly show that for people around the world, the climate crisis is a lived reality, which is a reality of recurring floods, droughts, and heat waves that are costing human lives, destroying livelihoods and development gains. A reality in which these extreme weather events often follow each other so quickly that people cannot recover from them. This is gradually becoming the new normal that people worldwide are living in. And the index clearly shows that impacts of extreme weather events are being felt worldwide, but in the long term, global South countries are particularly affected. The Climate Risk Index results in clear calls for action. First, for decision makers in the field of international climate policy. In order to prevent further devastating impacts, countries need to drastically cut their emissions. Countries need to urgently phase out burning fossil fuels, accelerate a just, equitable transition to renewables, and implement energy efficiency. The new climate plans, which countries were asked to submit until 10th February, need to be aligned with the 1.5-degree limit of the Paris Agreement. And these measures can boost the economy and save costs in the long term. A recent study calculated that the global economy could face a 20% loss in GDP by 2100. These damages are 6 times higher than costs for mitigation measures on a 1.5-degree pathway. Second, vulnerable countries cannot be left alone in dealing with impacts of climate change. High-income and high-emission countries must provide adequate climate finance, also for adaptation and for addressing losses and damages. At the last climate conference in Baku, countries agreed on 300 billion climate finance per year. This is very far away from the real needs. So at COP30 in Brazil, which is happening end of this year, governments have to decide on a roadmap to increase climate finance to the needed 1.3 trillion US dollar a year. Third, the index clearly shows that also countries in the global south must improve their climate risk management and adapt effectively to the consequences of climate change. Italy, Greece, and Spain rank under the 10 most affected countries in the long term, primarily due to very high heat wave-related fatalities. And I want to close this part by saying that the climate crisis is a global crisis without borders, and it can only be solved with multilateral climate action and effective implementation of the goals of the Paris Agreement. The climate crisis is not over just because a climate denier is now sitting in the White House, and so isn't multilateral climate action. But of course, other countries now have to fill the gap left by the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and the EU and other countries like China have a particular responsibility in this regard. Next slide. So we are publishing this index edition shortly before the start of the Munich Security Conference, also to highlight that the climate crisis is one of the biggest threats for human security. It aggravates conflicts, it destabilizes entire societies, and adversely affects peace and stability around the globe. Climate and development finance is a key determinant for human security. And the current behavior of the United States, including its stop of USAID, is leaving massive gaps in development and post-disaster support in global South countries. This is threatening the human security of millions. Leaders at the Munich Security Conference therefore need to develop strategies how to fill this gap left by the US as soon as possible. Moreover, climate change needs to be included in security-relevant processes. That means it needs to be integrated into national and regional security strategies. Countries need to operationalize this climate and security nexus in their foreign policies and actions, for example, by considering the different impacts of climate change on vulnerable groups, women and children, based on a human rights-based and gender-responsive approach. And peace and conflict resolution processes need to consider climate change as one important component. Finally, on the next slide, it shows that the index results result in clear messages and demands towards the upcoming federal election in Germany. Based on the year 2022, Germany is the 17th most affected country. And the data for Germany underlines how important climate adaptation measures are here too. In particular, the high fatalities as a result of massive heat waves, but also the consequences of devastating flood events are alarming. The federal elections in Germany will take place in 1.5 weeks only. And looking at the index results, it is negligence that climate change, as a key determinant for human security in Germany, doesn't play a role in the election campaign. In response to the index results, the new government must urgently do 3 things. First, it needs to increase climate resilience in Germany. The National Interdisciplinary Climate Risk Assessment, which was also published today, clearly shows that the consequences of climate change increase the risks to human health, infrastructure, and the economy. The new government therefore needs to continue to implement the Climate Adaptation Act and establish joint funding by the federal and state governments for relevant measures. Second, in order to prevent further impact, the new government needs to implement Germany's climate targets in an effective and fair way, while especially strengthening socially fair measures in the sectors that most lag behind, which is transport and buildings. In doing so, Germany must be very aware of the visibility of its frontrunner role and its capacity to also inspire policy and technology innovations worldwide. Third, Germany must also fulfill its existing international obligations and live up to its responsibilities. This includes keeping and increasing its commitments to international climate finance, including to adaptation and loss and damage finance, but also expanding socially just climate and energy partnerships. And with this, I hand back to David.
Yes, thank you to our panel for these insights into the newest edition. You can also see the newest index on our website. It should be online now. And with this, we would start the question and answers session, as indicated before. And for this, I would hand over to Linus, who will moderate that session.
Thank you. Now there is room for your question. Please note that we will answer questions from journalists first. Please tell us your name and the media outlet you work for. If you have questions concerning specific countries that are not included in the 10 most affected countries, we kindly ask you to send them via email to kri@germanwatch.org. You can raise your hand by clicking at the bar below in Zoom and post your question then via Zoom. Then you will be unmuted and can speak. Or you can ask your question via the Q&A tool or in the chat, and I will then ask them here in the room. Thanks. So looking at the Q&A tool, we already have a first question from Hannah Alcoseba Fernandez. She asks, how come the figures for US dollar lost, fatalities, and affected in the annex are different from those in the report text? For example, the report text about Asia states China 706 billion in losses, resulting to 42,000 fatalities. Myanmar, India, and Philippines, there's data too, but the annex has different figures for each country. Which figures should be referred to?
Yes, I can maybe quickly address that question. The figures you see in the annex, especially when you look at the 30-year table, are annual averages. So these are for every year for all 6 indicators, the annual averages of that specific indicator. So if you calculate that number by 30, you should arrive at the same number that we have elsewhere in the report.
So there are also questions in the chat. One of them is whether you can share which are the 3 US states that are part of the 10 countries most affected by climate change in 2022.
Maybe we can collect some questions first, and then we will answer them as a batch.
I don't see anyone raising their hand. You can also raise your hands and ask your question in person.
If not, I can maybe address that question. So we look only at the national level when we look into the numbers for losses and people that have died. We don't have access to the subnational levels. We can't say what states, for instance, in the United States of America were most affected.
There's one question, which countries in the top 10 in 2022 are considered high income?
In 2022?
Yes.
Just 1 second. In 2022, it is Italy, Greece, Spain, United States, Portugal. I just need to check that here. Sorry. Can we maybe first take another question? I'll just
Yeah, there are no further questions yet, but I encourage you to ask them in the chat via the Q&A tool, or you can raise your hand. Detlef Rieben, you can now speak.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I'm no longer a journalist, active journalist, but I have a question. Do you know of any delegation, any country that raises this question at the Munich Security Conference?
If I understood the question correct, it is about if a country would raise the question of climate risk at the security conference, which we would very much hope that this is being done. We know that climate and security is one of the main agenda items that will be discussed at the Munich Security Conference. And from our perspective, it is very important that countries talk about security while at the same time address and implement bold measures to address the climate crisis.
I hope that answered the question. Thank you for that. And there's another question in the chat. Is Puerto Rico considered a high-income country or a medium-income country at the index?
I would assume that Puerto Rico belongs to the high income group according to World Bank.
No further questions yet. So there's one raised hand. Jörg Ehring, you can speak now. We can't hear you yet. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. The latest year you have recorded is 2022. It's quite a long time. You don't have data for 2023 or 4, maybe?
Um, 2022 is the year for which we have the most complete set of data. That's why we chose the year 2022 this time around. There is data also already for 2023, but it's not complete. And therefore, we decided for this time to use the year 2022. At the end of the year, we will release a new edition of the Climate Risk Index at COP30. There we will also consider data from 2023.
Okay.
So I see one more question in the chat. Can the current political climate in the US make that country even more vulnerable to climate change, meaning the US?
Please read out this question again.
Whether the current political climate in the US will make the US even more vulnerable to climate change.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for this question. What the climate risk index clearly shows is that global north countries, including the US, are very much impacted by extreme weather events, which are intensified in intensity and frequency by climate change. And that also global north countries like the US do need to take risk management approaches to make these risks manageable and ensure the human security of their population. And if and these impacts do not disappear if you deny climate change. We see that Hurricane Mitch in the US in 2022 was the costliest disaster of that year with over 100 billion damage. And this needs effective risk management. And if you deny climate change and its consequences and do not apply these risk management measures, then of course you threaten the human security of your population.
Shall we quickly come back to the question on 2022 and the income categories?
Yes, it was in the...
Which countries we consider as high income in 2022? Yeah, that would be Italy, Greece, Spain, Puerto Rico, the United States, Portugal, and Bulgaria. And that is related to the World Bank country income groups.
Thank you. There are no more questions on the content, but one question whether the slides can be shared. Yes,
Yes, of course.
Link.
Please, in that case, please just send us an email and we're happy to share the slides.
Oh, I see no more questions. Just shared the email in the chat where you can send the request for the slides too.
And also, if there are additional questions coming up, you can also reach us via that email address.
There's a new hand, I think.
Yes, there's one. You can speak now. When to? You have to unmute yourself first and then you can ask your question.
Oh, sorry, I just hang out by mistake.
Okay, then we come to an end. Thank you for your interesting questions. As I said, the email for further questions is in the chat.
Then we say thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Climate Risk Index. Looking forward to interaction with you also over email. And as I said, the materials for the presentation for the index itself, you can find it on our Germanwatch website. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.